welcome the IAMC annual meeting parallel session called Methods 1, Destination Check. If that's not where you want to be, you might want to leave us. This looks like a excellent session with three top-notch speakers with topics that are somewhat complementary. So I'm glad to see that. I hope you will be too. So we have about an hour for the session. So the speakers have 15 minutes each to split between presentation and follow-up questions. And then hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes of general questions at the end. So just to keep on schedule, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Johannes KOCH from the Potsdam Institute, who will talk on adding macroeconomic detail to IAM's development of an energy system emulator. This, I know, is a research topic a lot of modeling teams around the world are extremely interested in. So I'm anxious to hear what Johannes has to say. Johannes, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Johannes. I'm a PhD student at the Potsdam Institute. And I'm going to talk today about the macroeconomic the energy system emulator that we've developed for WEYANT. So I would like to start with a quick motivational slide. So IAMs today definitely have more detail on the energy system side than on the macro side. And if someone wanted to add macroeconomic detail, they would have to make sure of two things. First of all, that there's a clear interface between the energy and macroeconomic parts of the IAM. Otherwise, any development on the macro side may end up breaking the entire IAM. And secondly, the model has to remain computationally feasible. And the use of an energy system emulator guarantees both by design. And that's the reason why we decided to build one for the WEYANT IAM. So the macro energy interface that comes to mind most quickly in WEYANT, at least, is that of the final energies. Final energy is a factor of production in the macroeconomic production function, and it is supplied at a cost determined within the energy model, and this cost is then reintroduced in the macroeconomic budget equation. So very simply, the emulator that we've constructed consists of sets of final energy supply curves that relate final energy price and quantity. Here is shown one such set for the electricity in the building sector in the India region within WEYANT. And first thing to note is that there are different supply curves for different final energy types, different regions, different years, different SSPs, and different CO2 budget or tax scenarios. So on the y-axis here is final energy price, and on the x-axis final energy demand. And the supply curves that we've constructed, or the shape that we decided upon, was a simple linear function that is a linear interpolation through these clouds of points. And the clouds of points essentially are just results of different WEYANT runs where we artificially varied the final energy demand, and thus creating these scatter of price quantity points in this price quantity plane. And we've restricted the supply curves or the parameters of the supply curves in such a way that neither the slope nor the y-intercept are ever negative. Okay, so in addition to the final energy information, or the price information, we also have emissions information. And so these CO2 curves were constructed in essentially the same way. Now here, just on the y-axis, we don't have final energy price, but CO2 emitted, or CO2 emissions associated with that final energy. Okay, how do we test the emulator? Or how do we use the emulator? First, we built a macro standalone model, which is essentially only the macroeconomic side of WEYANT. So it is built within the WEYANT code. It uses essentially the same code. It just includes fewer equations, fewer variables in the optimization, and therefore runs much faster. Also, it's just a smaller model, and it uses the energy system emulator. So in the following slide, I would like to show some key comparison plots between a SSP2 default WEYANT run with no carbon tax and a macro standalone run that uses the energy system emulator. So here the default runs The default run is shown in black, and we run with the emulator in dotted red. And I'd like to draw your attention first to the top left, where we see final energy quantities over time. So that's the aggregate final energy demand. And we can see that the emulator provides a very good fit to the default remind run. And that tells us that the linear approximation of our final energy supply curves are adequate, at least at the margin. Now, if you look to the top right, we can see that the final energy cost, which is computed as the integral under the supply curve, deviates substantially from the default final energy cost. And this tells us that, okay, this linear approximation isn't perfect. This is something we knew, but this definitely tells us this from this plot. This isn't the end of the world, though, because the final energy cost is such a small portion of the total income. If you look at the bottom left plot, the consumption difference is still very close using the emulator. And finally, in the bottom right, we can see also that the emissions curve are very good, and we match the emissions, the emissions associated with the energy system very well. Okay, so that we can summarize quickly like the main pros and cons of using the standalone model with the emulator. So pros are that we have a good approximation of most macro variables. And of course, the main reason for using an emulator, that we have a substantial decrease in runtime. So we have an approximately 80% decrease in runtime, depending, more or less depending on where you start the optimization from. And so this concretely translates to a remind run that is normally upwards of 40 minutes. And then this is decreased down to some standalone run that is less than 10 minutes. The cons are, of course, that we have no knowledge of the primary or secondary energies. We have a rough approximation of the energy system cost and no emissions feedback, yet these last 2 points are something that can or will be further improved with the further development of the macro standalone. Okay, now I've talked about the construction of the emulator and how it's used in this macro standalone framework, and that it provides, and we've seen that it provides good results. Now I would like to show you a quick exercise or experiment that we've did to demonstrate the use of the emulator, and this exercise is in line with correcting the remind scenarios for COVID, or to say incorporate some COVID corrections or COVID related corrections. And let me just point out here first, we're not trying to correct the underlying drivers of the remind project scenarios, which are the SSP, GDP, and labor paths. This will have to be done long term, but for now that requires too much coordination between working groups. So we've decided upon a quick fix on the level of the labor efficiencies. So concretely, we decided to model a COVID shock as a twofold shock on labor efficiency: a short-lived shock due to the lockdown restrictions in 2020 or 2021, and a long-term shock due to education loss. And for this entire exercise, we used exclusively the macro standalone for the test, calibration, and final runs. Now, since there is no education in remind per se, I want to go ahead and show you one more slide on how we integrated this education aspect into remind. So what we ended up doing is we included region-specific learning adjusted years of schooling values, which are measures of education that take into account that a year of schooling in Europe isn't equal to a year of schooling in Latin America, isn't equal to a year of schooling in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's learning adjusted. And to create the time series of these LAYS values, we used the early 2020 values given from the World Bank and extrapolated them back into 2005 and out into 2150 using the dynamics that are in the SSP education projections. Once we have this time series of LAYS, we include in the model, we multiply the labor factor by the LAYS value, and the labor factor in remind is just the working age population. Once this multiplication is done, we recalibrate the labor efficiencies to hit the pre-COVID SSP targets now with this new labor factor. And once we have the new efficiencies, we can load them in and then run a scenario where we decrease the Lay's value by a region-specific shock taken from a recent paper by Azevedo et al. That provides global estimates on Lay's shocks. And these shocks are then appropriately weighted according to the share of population affected in 2020 and then into the future as well. Okay, so now let me show you some results of this exercise. Here you can see the consumption for all 12 default Remind regions. And in black is a scenario without the COVID correction, in red with COVID correction. Then as you can see, the difference isn't very large, but it is there. And if we look into more detail at the relative difference of consumption, we can see that there is a difference of around, say, like an average of 3% globally. And here specifically, we can see this twofold shock that was implemented on the labor efficiencies. This first shock in 2020 and 2025, that's just this short-term shock that is simply a decrease in the growth of the labor efficiencies. And then we see this education shock, more of the long-term, that the shock first increases, then slowly fades out. And this just reflects the progression of the cohort of students that is affected now by the shock, entering the workforce and then slowly exiting the workforce towards the end of towards 2075. So there is a consumption difference. It varies across regions. And if we look at now the emission difference, we also see, it follows a similar dynamic as the consumption difference. We see a bit more variance between regions, but in general, it follows a similar pattern. Okay, and finally, I would just like to say that we hope, of course, that the use cases of the emulator aren't only the ones that I showed you just now, but that we hope to use the emulator within Remind in research directed towards different macroeconomic topics like distributional research, impact, welfare, capital market, growth, etc. And also outside of Remind, we're using the supply curves right now in a multi-sectoral growth model used for projections into the future, where the emulator provides the price information. Thank you. That was my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Johannes, for staying more or less on time. I don't see any questions yet. I did a nice follow-through as your colleague Elmar Kriegler just finished a parallel session on COVID analysis. I think that was an extra special bonus for this session. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to introduce our second speaker in this session, and he is John STERMAN, who's going to report on a very well-known modeling, simple strategy-oriented model that he and his team at MIT has developed. And the title of his talk is En-ROADS, a global energy and climate simulator to support strategic thinking and public outreach. I can testify at a personal level. I've seen this team in action, and they actually deliver what they say they would like to deliver. So take it away, John.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John, and appreciate the kind introduction. As John mentioned, this is work that I've done jointly through my group at MIT Sloan, the Sustainability Initiative there in the System Dynamics group, and with our partners, Climate Interactive. You see my co-authors here, and there's an even bigger team behind it that makes En-ROADS possible. So what I want to do is quickly go over the motivation and talk about why what we're doing here is complementary to and not a substitute for existing IAMs, GCMs, and so forth. And the basic motivation is clear. We know that climate action is not yet where it needs to be to give us a decent chance of limiting warming to 2, much less striving for 1.5. And it's due not to lack of technical knowledge or scientific knowledge as much as political polarization, vested interests, resisting efforts, and public confusion and apathy about these issues. The climate science, the GCMs, the IAMs, the folks in this meeting, what you all do, it's absolutely essential, of course, But it's difficult for leaders in government, business, civil society, and for the ordinary public, whether it's through the media, education, or other experiences, to use and understand what we're doing. And so fundamentally, and I know many of you are well aware of this, but fundamentally it's important to note that the deficit theory of science communication, which you see here, is just wrong. That deficit model says we do the research, we scientists, we publish it in the peer-reviewed literature through IPCC, et cetera. We give briefings and presentations to policymakers and other leaders, and then they're going to use that knowledge to change their behavior and change policies. That's just dead wrong. Of course, the research part of it is essential, but the idea that we simply present the facts and then people are going to change their behavior has been repeatedly shown to be incorrect, and not just in the climate domain. Most policymakers, most members of our Congress here, or foreign leaders and policymakers, you know, if you sit down and say, we're going to give you another briefing on climate change, this is their reaction. Oh my God, not again. And fundamentally what's going on here is research shows that showing people research doesn't work. And there's an abundant literature going back many decades on this. So what we have done is we've created a suite of interactive climate simulations. The first one was the C-ROADS model, Climate Rapid Overview and Decision Support System. And the latest one is En-ROADS, the Energy Rapid Overview and Decision Support System. They are calibrated and compared to the historical data going back many decades, and to the output of the GCMs through CMIP, et cetera, the IAMs and other models. But they run very quickly, essentially instantly, on ordinary laptops and tablets, and they're freely available. They've been used by a wide range of policymakers, negotiators, business and civil society leaders, educators, and so forth around the world. You see a couple of examples on the right here. And again, I want to stress that they are complementary to and not substitutes for the IAMs, the GCMs, et cetera, the other emulators. We can't do what we do without the great work of this community. So I'm going to give you a quick tour. This is the interface, but before we do it live, I want to show you a little bit of what's under the hood. So this is the overall architecture of the model. It's driven, as all the models are, by assumptions about population and GDP per capita growth. And then what you as a user do is you choose scenarios and policies, actions, like a carbon price or subsidies, taxes, or regulations on various energy supplies, fuels, et cetera, technologies, or on the end use side, non-CO2 gases, et cetera. And you can also assume various kinds of technical breakthroughs anytime you want. Those condition the evolution of the energy system and the energy markets. On the demand side, we keep track of the energy consuming capital stocks with vintages, efficiency of each vintage, retrofits and retirements, all endogenous. We look at stationary buildings, residential, commercial, separate from industrial and transportation. That on the energy supply side, you'll see in a minute how that works. But we include a variety of feedbacks, including learning curves and scale economies, R&D effects, complementary assets, for example, in electrification of transportation has complementary assets, charging infrastructure, for example. We include CCS and a variety of other technologies, CDR, et cetera. The market prices clear at all times, and the interaction there on the energy sector drives energy emissions from CO2. There's also a representation of the CO2 from land use, deforestation, afforestation, other land use, and all the other greenhouse gases and potential CDR technologies that might enhance CO2 removal. All of those then drive the climate sector, which I'll show you in just a second. The energy side, we keep track of course, all the fossil fuels, biofuels, nuclear, and then individually hydro, solar, wind, and geothermal. And we allow for the potential for a radical new technical breakthrough in zero carbon electric generation technology. The energy system extracts those fuels or generates that power, processes them, delivers them. This is a fairly standard kind of architecture that you're all familiar with. And then those energy carriers, whether they're liquid fuels, electricity, are used in the end use sectors. On the climate side, the En-ROADS energy and economic system we just looked at drives the emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and land use, et cetera. We also explicitly track the emissions of all the other greenhouse gases. You can see here methane, N2O, sulfur hexafluoride, and 28 species of fluorinated hydrocarbons, aerosols, black carbon, and we have 6 CDR technologies ranging from afforestation and agriculture through BECCS, biochar, direct air capture, and mineralization. These emissions drive a box model of the carbon cycle. In terms of Malte's great presentation in the plenary on the first day, it's in the middle. The level of aggregation is in the middle between the very simple models on the one hand and, say, MAGIC on the other hand. But we're explicitly keeping track of the stocks, emission budgets, and removal fluxes of all the greenhouse gases individually. Heat transfer and carbon transfer to the ocean with multiple layers, et cetera. And that drives global mean surface temperature change through radiative forcing, and then impacts like sea level rise and ocean acidification. We've worked hard to make sure the model accurately calibrates to history. Here you see going back to 1850 for the climate sector, for carbon dioxide, methane, temperature anomaly, and sea level rise. And on the economic side, calibrated against the levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar on the margin, and generation of wind and solar, just as examples. We've also calibrated to all the different SSPs. This is just one example showing SSP2 with each of the different radiative forcing levels. These are outputs of some of the IAMs that have done that, and here you see how our model compares to that. And the gap between our model and the ensemble of the IAMs is on the same order as the differences among the different IAMs within each RF level. That's at the aggregate level. When you drill down, we've also done this at the more disaggregated level for each of the components, GW, gross world product, energy intensity of the economy, carbon intensity of the energy system, emissions from various sources, primary energy from all the different fuels, et cetera. But let's do a demo. So we'll drop out of PowerPoint here. And now what you're seeing is the actual simulation. And there's, on this graph on the top left, you're seeing total global primary energy with coal in brown, building up from that oil in red, natural gas in blue, all the different renewables in green, biofuels in hot pink, and nuclear in light blue, historical data up through the most recent, and then a projection going forward that depends on your assumptions about population, which you can vary. And as I vary them from the low end of the UN current range to the high end, the model instantly simulates and gives you the choice to build your own scenario. And you can look at this at the regional level. If you change population, you'll see how that changes according to the UN's projections. Let me go back, make sure I'm at the base case. You can do the same with economic growth, short run and long run. I'm not going to spend time on that right now, but this basically allows you to capture any of the different scenarios that you like. You also have the ability here to change a wide range of assumptions in the model, assumptions about how the climate works, climate sensitivity, mixing CO2 fertilization, sea level rise from additional melting of the great ice sheets beyond what's currently assumed, methane and CO2 from permafrost thawing, etc., and a wide range of other assumptions covering all the economic and energy aspects of the model. So you're free to try your own assumptions and build your own scenarios. In this particular case that you're seeing here, which you should think of as a reference no action beyond what's currently actually happening, not just, so we're not including new pledges that aren't backed up by action. We're looking at a continued growth of global primary energy. This is, of course, consistent with the Kaya story. We are assuming a continued decline, even in this no further action case, in energy intensity of the GDP and moderate decline in the carbon intensity of final energy here. But that growth still leads to substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Green here at the bottom is from land use. The largest, of course, is CO2 from fossil fuels. The fluorinated gases are here, then methane and nitrous oxide. And that leads to expected warming of 3.6 C. And because this model is used extensively in the United States, we also report always Fahrenheit. And you can switch between which units are prominent here. And for example, if you're using Fahrenheit, you're also getting all the other measures like sea level rise in feet. If you go back to metric, you get them in meters. So let's take a look. And here's the question for all of you all. What should we do? Now, normally we have more time than we do today. And what we always do is we ask whoever is using the model to decide what they want to try. So you could work on the energy supply system, you can put a price on carbon, you can work on the end use side, you can work on forestry, afforestation, methane and the other gases, and CDR technologies. We have very limited time. If you want, though, go ahead and type into the chat, I hope I can see it, yeah, what you'd like to try. In the meantime, let's try a carbon price. So how much of a carbon price? How about $40 a ton, a number phased in over 10 years globally, and that makes a substantial difference, drops 0.3 C, much less coal and other fossil fuels, much more renewables, more nuclear as well. You can see that here, you're getting more nuclear as well as much more production from renewables, but you're still well above 2 degrees. Well, you could raise the carbon price further. It's a high leverage policy, but even at $80 a ton, we're still at 3.1. So what else might be interesting to try? Well, let's try phasing out coal. One way we can do that is by stopping the construction of all new coal infrastructure in a year we choose. I have 2025 here, but you can change it. And that begins to phase out coal. Interestingly, it takes a long time for the remaining coal to go out. And that's because when you phase it out with no other actions, you increase the profitability of the remaining ones because the demand hasn't changed that much and the supply is being reduced, so the prices go up. And that delays the retirement of the remaining coal plants. But that helps. We're down to 3. We could promote renewables further. You could work on the end use side, energy efficiency in transportation and in buildings and industry. Those are high leverage policies because you're reducing the need for all the energy production there as well. We can electrify transport and buildings, as I've done in my own home. No fossil fuel, deep energy retrofit. We make 50% more energy than we use through the solar on our roof now. We're down to 2.5. We can cut deforestation, and we can go in and cut the production of the non-CO2 gases. They've already fallen a little bit because of the reduction in demand through the efficiency side, but let's cut it further. And there you go, 2 degrees, 3.6 Fahrenheit in expectation, and without assuming any magical new technical breakthroughs like fusion, which you could try out here, or next generation nuclear or direct air capture. So that's a quick demonstration. And I think at this point, I'd like to reserve plenty of time for questions. So let me just make sure that we're able to see the questions. Yep, and wrap it up by just saying that what we're trying to do here is create a tool that is complementary to the great models that are coming out of this community, a tool that can and has been used by policymakers and elected officials at all levels. So for example, I and my team, we've personally briefed now over 200 members of the United States Senate and Congress, 7 US state governors, other policymakers in other countries around the world. And it's especially used in education and workshops around the world. Less than 1 year ago, we launched our Climate Ambassador training program. And as of yesterday, we have over 250 En-ROADS Climate Ambassadors, an incredibly diverse group from 46 countries working in 29 languages. And I would encourage any of you who are interested to check out the model. You can sign up here. You can go to enroads.org. Everything is freely available, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I do remember a memorable briefing your team did to the 2018 incoming congressional delegation, literally as they were first seated in the Capitol. So I hope you're planning on doing such a thing with the new class in next month coming up. So that is definitely the level at which this tool has been used. We don't have a lot of time, but I did see one question you might want to clarify, and it regards how you're considering or could consider CDR. I thought you actually covered that a little bit, maybe not in detail in the application area. So I think there's obviously a lot of interest in that, as you well know.
Great. So at the top level, when you pull the CDR slider, you're getting all the different CDR technologies that we include to some extent. If I turn on the advanced settings, and there's advanced settings for all the sliders, you can do them individually. So we have BECS. You decide what fraction of the estimated potential storage from BECS you might achieve. You decide what year its deployment starts. We have DAC, we have enhanced mineralization, agricultural practices, and biochar. And of course, separately, we have afforestation, so you can simulate the Trillion Trees campaign. It's quite interesting. It's a great thing to plant a lot of trees in most places, but it doesn't make that much difference. And the reason, of course, is it just takes too long for them to grow to the scale and size that removes a significant amount of carbon in time. You are getting here, something like 6 or 7 gigatons per year of removals, but that doesn't happen until the out years of the century, and by then it's largely too late. If you're just looking at the reference case, which you see here, it makes very little difference. This is a kind of big insight for folks. And of course, you can change all the assumptions about all of these CDR technologies, including afforestation, BECS, DAC, etc.
Great. Thank you, Rich. John, we may have more questions at the end. We should have ample time for additional questions. At this point, I'd like to see if we can get Paul KISHIMOTO from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis to join us here on stage. Hi, great. Paul. Welcome. Good to see you. Do you want to share slides and I can introduce you? So this is Paul KISHIMOTO, as I mentioned, from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, and he's going to report on some work his team's done and give a talk on reproducible development of IAM variants. The example of MESSAGEix-Transport, obviously a lot of the IAMs are trying to get much more detail and complexity built into their transport sectors. So Paul, can you share slides at this point?
Good day, everyone. My name is Paul KISHIMOTO. Thank you for the opportunity to present this talk on reproducible development of IAM variants. So this is a method session. I'm going to focus on the methods we use to develop the models rather than the theory embodied in the models themselves. I'm briefly going to motivate by introducing some less common perspectives on that modeling process and the insights we can get from those perspectives. And then I'm going to present some generalized prescriptive advice and specific practices that we are introducing in order to improve our model development, with, of course, the ultimate goal of doing more, better, and more valid science. By we, I mean the IIASA Energy Program that develops the MESSAGEix Global Integrated Assessment Model, but in particular, our sub-team developing a model variant called MESSAGEix-Transport, which I will introduce, but I actually won't dwell on it because the advice is sort of broadly applicable, and I don't want to eat up the time talking about the particular technologies we have in our particular model. So as integrated assessment modelers, we're really chiefly interested in the real world systems of which our models are only a representation. And these are economic, social, institutional, energy systems, or systems, in our case, transport systems. But there are two other lenses that I want to show you that are also very useful if we remember to apply them. In the first, that we note that a model is a scientific instrument used to perform experiments. And this is another scientific instrument. It's part of the Large Hadron Collider. It's an instrument that took 10 years and some 8 billion euro to construct. It has tens of thousands of components, and each of those is precisely specified, carefully manufactured, installed, calibrated. And all of that is to ensure the validity of the experiments that are conducted using this instrument. You could also think of something similar, such as a benchtop microscope or a centrifuge or something. So the experiments we perform with an IAM are counterfactual ones, and we ask questions like, what if this technology were cheaper, or what if some other policy were enacted? But for the results to be scientific, we still need a good instrument. And for the results to be valid, that instrument has to be calibrated. And for model, that means ensuring it's an accurate representation of the real world. And that allows us to say that what happens in the model would also obtain in the real world under the modeled conditions. And importantly, very importantly, that calibration has to be repeated from time to time using a well-defined procedure as the real world changes. The model must also be possible to replicate or reproduce the experiment using the same instrument. And I'll get more into that shortly. The second alternate perspective is that models are pieces of software. And from that perspective, we notice that the field of software development is much, much broader than just our IAM community at this conference. And we can look into that field for effective and efficient practice. Much software development is done for profit, and so there's close attention to costs. And we can think of these mainly in the many ways in which our resources, by which chiefly I mean researchers' time or our money, is affected by wrestling with code. And there's a number of categories of costs. I won't belabor these, but answering all these questions that you see on the slide takes time. And the more time that we sink into these, the less time we have for doing all of the research addressing the questions that we are interested in. On this slide 8, I list some facts about IAM development in particular. I'm not going to read them off. I'm only going to observe that the content, interest, and directions of IAM research are taking us in a way or direction where inefficient development practices and models that are expensive or costly to validate are going to become more and more of serious obstacles to producing reliable, valid, and thus impactful research. So this is one way to frame this is that process costs are an obstacle, and when it is expensive to calibrate, to validate, or to reproduce models, this can be a motivation or a disincentive to transparently disclose and fix errors, to adopt new theory, new structures and data, and to make combinations of models and model variants to address important questions. And that leads to doubt about the knowledge derived from models and the limited usefulness of that knowledge. So next, I'd like to explain how starting on message transport has led us to seriously confront and start to address that particular challenge. This is a model variant, by which I mean it is not simply stuck onto the side of the base model, which is MESSAGEix-Transport, on which it is based, but it involves some sort of complex manipulation of that model to produce a very closely related but more detailed model, as John said. There's some terminology here, which I can return to if you're curious. So we have a sort of schematic, and this is just to show you that the model building code in the center pre-processes some data that is specific to this transport variant, and then it takes an existing model with structure and data, and it removes some of that structure, some of that data, it adds others, and it modifies others. And this produces the model, the particular model variant. So the important thing about the process of modeling and the process of research is that we are developing continually both the base model, which I've drawn as a puzzle piece here, and the transport model in parallel at the same time. And that often entails costly adjustment. So if there are changes to the narrative or the structure or the data of the base model, then we must also decide whether to incorporate those changes into the variant and check and adjust the outcomes, or to simply not take advantage of those improvements. So what we try to do is we try to focus on from scratch reproducibility and basically write code that rebuilds the model from scratch every time we use it. That means adjustments are less costly, model variants can be generated more easily, and validation and verification becomes simpler. And this kind of approach is also valuable because we don't just have one variant, we also have a buildings variant, a water variant, we have country-specific models, and we want to know, can they be combined, or if we do combine them, in what order should we assemble these pieces? And we want to guide this sort of more advanced research that incorporates all these differences. So I'll move on to the advice. I've got 4 pointers for developing models, in particular IAMs for reproducibility. The first point is to do the basics right. So research teams should choose, learn, and use a version control system. They should choose, learn, and use a version control system platform. And most importantly, more than the technical choices, is to provide resources, time and support to allow researchers, individual researchers, to learn how to use these tools and their many features, and then decide in particular for your team and for your team's workflow how to use those features. And that's something that we've done in the energy program at IIASA. The next point is to modularize and then generalize. So it's very common practice, and a lot of people get through their master's or their PhD writing really long scripts, and that is not a way to do valid reproducible research. So code has to be modularized. I give some examples of the kind of things that should be written once, right? So the principle is don't repeat yourself, because repeating the same calculation over and over again multiplies opportunities for error. The next point of advice is to generalize. So separate the model representation, structure, and data. So once you've got the code modularized, it should be able to work whether you're using 5 or 10 regions, 5 or 10 year time periods. So the way that works for us in MESSAGEix-Transport is that we have a generalized formulation. The base model populates that with, a specific set of technologies, and then the model variant simply removes a few technologies, adds a few technologies, and relies on the existence of some other technologies to build the richer transport representation that we work with. Second last, test code at all levels. So modelers have to learn about test-driven development. They have to be trained and given guidance in writing and running tests. And those are code that checks other codes. So when we have these functions, for instance, computing a per capita value, this is validation. It's checking that when we do this calculation, we get a result that we understand to be scientifically valid. Those small tests are called unit tests. We have literally hundreds of them in the stack of different software packages that implement our model. And then you move on to writing integration tests, which basically set up and run the entire model and look in particular at the content of the results and ensure those are valid and not changing as other modifications and improvements are made to the code. We also use what are called continuous integration services, and there are links here that will be available in the slides to run those tests automatically on any incremental change to the code, and also on regular schedules. So for instance, we have tests that run every night that resolve the same scenarios to ensure that the outcomes of those scenarios are not changing as we expand and improve our model. And these, again, are important because they reduce the cost of identifying when model changes and improvements disturb things that we expect the model to continue doing. And the final point would be to write clean and documented code, especially write code comments. And again, this is about checking and enforcement, incorporating it into daily coding practice, and ensuring researchers ask one another to do this instead of letting it go to the last minute when it's often just simply skipped. There are also a number of tools, and there are tools for generating auto documentation, which we use extensively. So if you visit docs.messageix.org, that shows some automatically built documentation that is regenerated every time we make small modifications to our code. And it is public. So to conclude, just some wrap-up thoughts. These better processes invest resources up front to save in the long run. It's really important to choose to work this way, to notice the benefits and say, hey, that investment a while ago has now saved us time. Parts of this skill set are very foreign to most of our modelers. It's not included in our training historically or even in current programs, so we have to invest in that training and learning. And finally, that we should look to other sectors, other fields, and even other disciplines such as climate modeling for best practices, and encourage sharing and emulation of these common practices so that we can all get better at doing this for our respective models. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was a great talk. Actually, I find these three talks complemented each other quite well. I'd like to now ask our two other speakers to join. That would be Johannes and John, to join Paul and I on stage at this point. We don't yet have any questions in the Q&A for Paul. I would like to ask John two questions. He and his team have already answered some of these online, but I would like to give him a chance for the broader audience to talk about two things, and that is the potential to incorporate damage functions in your framework, number one, and the other one, more on the mitigation side perhaps, but maybe not exclusively. Can you put in, or I think you already have done some of this, some notion of the degree of international cooperation, which could be common policies, financial transfers, and other technology transfer, and other such things?
Yeah, great. So first of all, on the CDR, or the damage function, in the version I showed you today, damages are turned off. We've been working on this. As you know, it's an area with a great deal of disagreement. What we are going to do is early in 2021, although I don't want to promise a specific date, we will be deploying a version in which you can choose your own damage function, either the Nordhaus function, the Weitzman function, or any of the others that are out there in the literature, or pick your own assumptions about damages. And what you'll see is that as warming proceeds, that will reduce economic growth, GDP per capita. I would say that, and I think this is consistent with what everybody else has found in their modeling, damages do not by themselves stop warming, right? So it's just not the case that climate change is going to be harming the economy unless you make some very extreme assumptions, so much so that emissions fall to the point that climate change ceases. In other words, cancer cures smoking, but that's not how we want to address this problem. So watch for that. We issue regular updates every month or so, and that one will be coming. The other question about international cooperation, it's a global model right now. We do have population and GDP at the regional level. So this is part of the interaction that happens with users, is users have the conversation. For example, when we presented it for a large group of senators, there was an intensive conversation about, well, wait a minute, does what the United States does in the future even matter, given that China is by far the world's largest emitter? And that gets you into a very important conversation about how to build global cooperation, global leadership by the big emitting countries, et cetera. That's what we want this model to do, but it's not represented in the model explicitly at the current time. The
one simple way that even in the DICE model, there's a participation function. It just says how much of the world is in. That, of course, doesn't do the bilaterals that you're talking about, but it is a start. I imagine in the new administration, there'll be more interest in this than there was in the previous one because of the dominant theme of global policy, approach to global policy issues in the current administration.
Right.
I don't see any
that's right.
urgent questions.
What'll happen is, if I can just make a very quick comment on that, what happens is in the model, if you set a carbon price here, $50 or even $100 a ton, you decide when that starts, so not 2021 perhaps, but 2025, and over how many years will it phase in? So you can think of that as how quickly that carbon price is adopted and implemented in the different countries around the world. And of course, if you make it substantially longer, things get worse. So this is one way in which users can get a feel for how important it is to bring the other nations on board with greater ambition.
Great, great. Thank you, John. Now, I don't see any specific questions for Paul or Johannes, but I would like to ask them a general question. I think John's already done this on his talk, and it has two parts. Is what is your experience dealing with users so far? Both of you touched on this, number one. And number two, there does seem to be some interest in getting more information on the work that you presented. So I wonder if I could call in first Johannes and then Paul to address those two questions. And then maybe if somebody submits questions, we'll have a bit more time left. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left in the session. So Johannes, do you want to take those couple of general questions?
I mean, on users using our code in the Remind code in general, or are we talking about the standalone codes and the emulator developed? Because
well, a little bit of both, but particularly on this new feature, what are you looking out for? I know actually in Paul's talk, he actually anticipated a lot of things that he had thought might be a problem, and it seemed like, let's hear what he has to say. They are kind of emerging, and they're trying to, do the right thing and pursue best practice, as John has already touched on for his system. So, Johannes.
I mean, absolutely. So everything that Paul said is, I would say, something we try to do here. Maybe not super successful yet. Specifically on continuous integration, we haven't set that up extensively so far. And I have a question, maybe also for you, Paul, how to do that. Is like, how do the tests know what is supposed to change and what not? I mean, that's because you want to change something, that's why we developed the model. So yeah. And on the use of Remind, so the standalone model and the emulator, for now I definitely can say that it's only been me and maybe one other person who's been using it, because it's still a development phase, and it's on a different Git branch. So I have to merge that back into the real Remind model successfully, hopefully soon. And otherwise in Remind in general, I think so we've been working on tutorials for users so that they can get into using the model more easily, quicker. We've had some issues with data, rights, so rights to share the input data. And I think we've had a couple of external users already install Remind and start running first Remind scenarios on external devices or on their computers. But it's definitely not super out there yet. I mean, we only went open source with Remind, I think, last year. So it's still in development. Yeah, that's all I got to say on that.
Great. I'll turn it over to Paul. We did get a specific question for him, partially regarding this general question. Can you say anything more about how tests play out in the context of large amounts of data going into these models, differing from the small data in software unit tests?
Yeah, the model that we have does work with large quantities of input data. So the kind of test that we write there is just to ensure that everything that we expect to be getting through. So if we have a large spreadsheet with many sheets and that data has to be read and filtered and combined and so on, then we expect certain quantities will be there in the results. So we'll check that goes through. And then if that process ever gets disturbed, say somebody changes the formatting of the spreadsheet and the data is no longer in the expected place, that test will start to fail and it alerts us so we can fix it. So John's more general question, two short answers. So one thing is that, my colleagues have invested a lot of time over the past several years in developing tutorials, in doing training sessions and so on. And all of this complementary material is very important to help bring new users on board. So we often work with the national member organizations of IASA, and they're connected to researchers in countries around the world. And those people will come and take a 1-week workshop with us. But the level of technical knowledge required to do integrated assessment or even just energy systems modeling is quite high. And then we're adding the technical knowledge necessary to run this software. So we really have to be careful and upfront with people that, look, you need to know this list of things in order to do this successfully. And if you don't, we don't want to lead you out into the deep water and then let you drown, right? So the possible, let's say, unlike the En-ROADS tool, the possible user base for these big models is really kind of small, right? We know most of the people who would be using them. The other point is that we're trying to hire at the moment a community manager or research software engineer specifically to deal with the requests that we get in on our public GitHub repository. So we get people who have found this. There's a PhD student in, say, Korea or Pakistan or somewhere, has found this model, thinks it's a good thing to use for their doctoral research. But then they run into some trouble trying to do the things that they want. And so they come to us with requests. And I think most academic and research organizations don't have any resources set aside to do tech support for academic users. But really, that's a thing we want to provide in order to allow these people to benefit from the work that we've done. So there's a little bit more investment as well there to make that possible.
So at this point, in true Lawrence O'Donnell fashion, I'd like to give the last word to John STERMAN. I did pick up from the chat dialogue or Q&A dialogue, you do have a member of your team who's actually partially at IIASA. I do think on the 2 or 3 things that have come up so far, there is some possible joint learning that could go on. I know the European teams represented here by the two other speakers have done a lot on quote unquote stakeholder involvement. So I don't know either on that side or on the impact side if you have immediate plans to pursue this through your staff member, Sybil Ecker, who seems to appear in the Q&A stream quite heavily. So I'll give you the last word on that and anything else you want to say in concluding your.
Well, so first of all, we're thrilled that Sybil is now on the Climate Interactive team and working with us. And we are, in general, very eager to connect with the other modeling groups, not just at IIASA, but anywhere in the world. Having watched a great many of the presentations in this conference so far, I found it incredibly valuable. I'm going to be reaching out, our team will be reaching out to a number of the presenters to follow up on their work, whether it's on COVID or transportation or whatever it might be. So yes, we're very eager to learn more from all of the folks out there and engage with people where we can, subject to our capacity constraints as well as those of the folks out there.
So at this point, we're right on the money. Thank you, John, for doing the last word duties so efficiently. So I'd like to sincerely thank our 3 speakers for great presentations and Q&A involvement, great questions from the audience. And we now have a poster session coming up. So thank you one and all for a great session.